There is a piece of charred parchment behind glass in front of me right now. It is no bigger than my palm. The edges are black and curled like a dead leaf. The center holds 3 Greek letters that nobody alive can fully translate because the words around them are gone, burned, erased, forgotten. This is one of the last physical things left from the greatest library that ever existed. And before you finish this video, I am going to tell you something that will make you angry. Everything you were taught about how this library died is a lie. You were told Julius Caesar burned it. He did not. You were told the Christians burned it. They did, but only at the end. You were told the Arabs burned it. That story was invented 6 centuries after the fact. The truth is uglier than any of those lies. The Library of Alexandria was not murdered. It was not destroyed in a single dramatic night by a single dramatic villain. It died slowly, over 700 years, of a disease that is still killing libraries today. It died of indifference. My name is Mortimer Quill. You are standing in my archive. There are 6 scrolls on the table in front of you, each one charred at the edges, each one belonging to a different century. I am going to open them, one by one, and walk you through the real story of how the human race lost more knowledge in 700 years than we have recovered in the 2000s since. I want you to understand something before we begin. When that library finally went silent, it took with it the complete works of Democritus, who described atoms 2,300 years before we split one. It took 113 plays by Sophocles. We have 7 of his plays. 7. There were 120. It took the history of Carthage, written by the Carthaginians themselves. It took the maps the Phoenicians drew of coastlines we are still trying to find. It took medical texts, engineering manuals, astronomical tables, philosophical dialogues, and the first encyclopedia of the ancient world. We do not know what we lost. That is the worst part. We do not even have a complete list of the missing. So Alexander died young in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era. His empire fell apart almost overnight. His generals carved it into pieces. Ptolemy took Egypt. He took it because Egypt was rich, defensible, and contained the new city Alexander had founded only a few years earlier on the Mediterranean coast. A city built on a swamp and a fishing village, designed by a Greek architect named Democritus of Rhodes, with streets laid out in a perfect grid for the first time in human history. Ptolemy looked at this city, and he had an idea that, as far as we can tell from the surviving evidence, no one had ever had before in quite the same way. He decided to copy everything. Not some books, not the important books. Every book, every scroll, every fragment, every poem, every receipt, every drinking song, every philosophical argument, every medical recipe, every astronomical chart, every law code, every cookbook, every play, every prayer. Everything ever written in any language by anyone, anywhere. He wanted it all under one roof in his new city. To do this, he founded an institution he called the Mouseion. The word means a temple of the Muses, the 9 goddesses of arts and sciences. From this Greek word, 2,300 years later, we get the English word museum. But the Mouseion was not what we mean by a museum. It was a research institute, a university, a residential community of scholars, and a library, all on the same campus, in the royal district of Alexandria called the Bruchion, right next to the harbor. He hired a man named Demetrius of Phalerum to build the collection. Demetrius was a former tyrant of Athens who had been exiled and was looking for a job. He was a student of Aristotle's school, and he understood books the way a butcher understands meat. He knew what mattered, what was a forgery, what was a copy of a copy, what was rare, what was disposable. Ptolemy gave him an unlimited budget. Unlimited. Let me tell you what Demetrius did with that money. This is the part of the story they never teach you in school, and it is one of the most ruthless cultural acquisition programs in human history. Every ship that docked in the harbor of Alexandria was searched, not for weapons, for books. Customs officials would board the vessel and demand any scrolls, any tablets, any written material on board. Personal letters, business records, library copies, prayer books, anything. The owner had no choice. The books were confiscated and taken to the Mausion, where scribes would copy them. The owner would be given the copy. The original would be kept by the library. There was a special category of these stolen originals, marked with the Greek phrase __quote _0__, which means __quote _1__. These books were the rarest and most valuable items in the collection because their owners had not chosen to part with them. They had been taken by force of state. I want you to feel the size of this. Imagine arriving in a foreign port and the customs officials walk on board and take every book you own. You are given a copy on cheap papyrus and told to leave. The original, with your grandfather's notes in the margin, with your family's marks on the cover, the original is now property of a king you have never met, in a city you may never see again, and there is nothing you can do about it. That is how Alexandria built the largest library in the ancient world, not by trade, not by purchase, by organized, state-sponsored, harbor-mandated theft. But it gets worse, or better, depending on how you feel about books. Ptolemy III, who ruled later, sent ambassadors to Athens. He asked the Athenians for their official state copies of the three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were the master texts. The originals, kept in the state archive, used to settle disputes about what these playwrights had actually written. The Athenians were nervous. They were poor, and the Egyptians were rich. Ptolemy offered to put down a deposit of 15 talents of silver, which in modern terms is probably $400,000 or $500,000, just to borrow the texts. He swore on his throne that he would return them. He kept the originals. He sent back the copies. He let the Athenians keep the silver as compensation. But he knew, and they knew, that no amount of silver replaces the master text of Sophocles. He had bought the soul of Athenian theater for $400,000, and a written promise he openly broke. The library now had the master copies. The copies of copies stayed in Athens. And every single Greek play we know today, every line of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides that we can quote, came down to us through the version that was in Alexandria. Not Athens, Alexandria. Think about that the next time you read Antigone or Oedipus Rex. You are reading the version that a king stole and refused to return. By the time Demetrius and his successors had been at work for 50 years, the library held something between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls, depending on which ancient source you trust. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Call it 500,000 scrolls. Each scroll was, on average, the equivalent of one chapter of a modern book. So, in modern terms, the library held roughly 50 to 70,000 books. By the standards of any other place in the ancient world, this was an impossible number. The next largest library, the one at Pergamon in modern Turkey, held about 200,000 scrolls and was considered a wonder. Alexandria had 2 to 3 times more, and it was not just a warehouse, it was a working laboratory. Scholars lived on site. The Ptolemies paid them salaries, gave them rooms, fed them at a common table, and asked nothing of them except that they read, write, and argue. Geography, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, biology, philology, mechanical engineering. Every subject that we now call a science had a corner of the Mausion working on it. They invented disciplines that did not exist anywhere else. They built astronomical instruments that would not be matched for 1,600 years. This is the institution Ptolemy created. This is the institution his descendants funded for almost 300 years. This is the institution that would, slowly and unevenly, be erased from the face of the earth. Close that scroll. We are moving to the next century. Mortimer Quill is going to take a moment here, friend, to light a candle. There is a draft in this archive. There is always a draft. You feel that on the back of your neck? That is the second scroll opening on its own. The second scroll is about the man who measured the planet. His name was Eratosthenes. The second scroll is about the man who measured the planet. His name was Eratosthenes of Cyrene. He was born around 276 before the Common Era, in a Greek colony on the coast of what is now Libya. He came to Alexandria as a young man, studied under the best minds of his generation, and around 245 before the Common Era, Ptolemy III appointed him the chief librarian of the Mausion, the most powerful intellectual position in the known world. He was about 30 years old. Eratosthenes was, by any modern measure, a polymath of frightening range. He wrote on geography, he wrote on mathematics, he wrote on poetry, he wrote on philosophy, he wrote on astronomy, he wrote on chronology. He invented the discipline of geography itself and gave it the name we still use, Geographia, meaning the writing of the earth. He drew the first map that included parallels and meridians. He calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis to within a fraction of a degree. He compiled a list of every Olympic Games held up to his lifetime, a chronological framework that Greek historians used for the next 400 years. And his colleagues called him Beta. Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, the number 2. They called him second best. Their reasoning was that he was not the absolute first in any single field. He was not the greatest mathematician. That was Archimedes. He was not the greatest poet. That was Callimachus. He was not the greatest astronomer. That was Aristarchus. So the scholars of Alexandria, in their pettiness, looked at a man who was world-class in 7 different disciplines and decided that being merely excellent in all of them made him second-rate, a jack of all trades, a dilettante. Imagine being called second best by people who could not even leave their courtyard. Imagine measuring the planet itself and being told that the man who measured a single triangle did it better. Let me tell you how he measured the planet, because this is the part of the story that, if I do my job right, will make you sit up in your chair. Eratosthenes had read, somewhere in the 500,000 scrolls of the library, a traveler's report from a city in southern Egypt called Syene, modern Aswan. The report said something strange. It said that on one specific day of the year, at noon, the sun shone directly down a deep well in Syene. The water at the bottom reflected the sun back up perfectly. There was no shadow on the inside walls of the well. The sun was directly overhead. Most people would read this and shrug. A curiosity, a travel anecdote. Eratosthenes read it and saw a question that no one had ever asked before. If the sun is directly overhead in Syene at noon on this day, what is it doing in Alexandria, 800 kilometers north, at the same moment? He set up an experiment. On the same day of the year, at the same hour, he had his assistants measure the shadow cast by a vertical pole in Alexandria. The pole cast a shadow, a small one, but a measurable one. He calculated the angle of that shadow against the pole. It came to approximately 7 degrees and 12 minutes, about 1/50th of a full circle. Now follow me here, because this is where a librarian who had never left Egypt did something that nobody on Earth had ever done. He reasoned, if the sun is so far away that its rays arrive parallel, and yet there is a shadow in Alexandria, but no shadow in Syene at the same instant, then the surface between Alexandria and Syene must be curved. If it were flat, there would be no shadow in either place, or shadows in both. The fact that there is a shadow here and not there means the Earth bends. He then reasoned, if the angle of that shadow is 1/50th of a full circle, then the distance between Alexandria and Syene must be 1/50th of the total distance around the Earth. He hired a class of professional surveyors called bimatistai, men trained to walk in steps of perfectly equal length and count those steps as a unit of distance. He had them walk from Alexandria to Syene. They came back with a number, about 5,000 stadia. Multiply by 50, 250,000 stadia. The Greek stadion is not a fixed unit. and there is some scholarly argument about exactly which version Eratosthenes used. But using the most likely value, his answer comes out to approximately 39,690 kilometers. The actual circumference of the Earth, measured today by satellites, is 40,075 kilometers. He was off by less than 1%. In 240 before the Common Era, with a stick, a well, a textbook, and a team of professional walkers, 1,700 years later, in 1492 of the Common Era, Christopher Columbus would set sail for India based on his own estimate of the Earth's size. Columbus believed the Earth was about 30,000 kilometers around. He was off by 25%. He was off by 25% because he had ignored Eratosthenes and used a smaller, more flattering number from a later Roman source. If he had trusted the second best librarian of Alexandria, he would have realized that India was nowhere near where he was sailing, and he would have stayed home. Instead, he ran into a continent that, as far as he was concerned, should not have existed. And he died believing he had reached Asia. The man who measured the planet correctly died in Alexandria around 194 before the Common Era. The ancient sources tell us he had gone blind in his old age, and rather than live without being able to read, he stopped eating. He starved himself to death. The chief librarian of the largest library on Earth chose to die because he could no longer read its books. That is the second scroll. Roll it carefully. The edges are fragile. The third scroll smells of smoke. This is the one they teach in school. This is the one everyone thinks they know. This is the lie. The year is 48 before the Common Era. Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, has chased his rival Pompey across the Mediterranean to Egypt. Pompey is murdered on the beach by Egyptian officials before Caesar even arrives. Caesar is presented with Pompey's severed head as a gift. He weeps, the sources say. Whether the tears are real or political, no one will ever know. Caesar is now stuck in Alexandria, in the middle of a brutal civil war between the teenage king Ptolemy XIII and his older sister, Cleopatra VII. Caesar takes Cleopatra's side, possibly because she is brilliant, possibly because she is, by all accounts, charming beyond description, possibly because she had herself smuggled into his quarters rolled up in a carpet, probably some combination of the three. The Egyptian forces loyal to Ptolemy lay siege to Caesar in the royal quarter of Alexandria. The royal quarter, you will remember, contains the Mouseion and the Great Library. Caesar finds himself in a tactical disaster. He has too few men. He is cut off from supplies. The harbor is held by enemy ships. He makes a decision that will define his name in the history of books for the next 2,000 years. He orders his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor. Plutarch, writing about 150 years later, says the fire spread from the ships to the dockyard, and from the dockyard to the warehouses on the shore, and from the warehouses, the flames consumed a large quantity of books. The Roman writer Aulus Gellius gives a number: 700,000 scrolls, lost in one night. This is the version you were taught. Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria. End of story. It is not the end of the story. It is barely the beginning. And the parts that get left out are the parts that matter. First, the 700,000 figure. That is almost certainly not the contents of the main library. That is almost certainly the inventory of warehouses near the docks, where new acquisitions were stored before being processed and moved to the Mouseion proper. Books that had been confiscated from ships, books that had been purchased, books that had been donated, books that were waiting in the customs queue. They burned. They were a real loss. But the main library, in the Bruchaion district, several blocks inland, was not destroyed. We know this. Strabo, the Greek geographer, visited Alexandria around 20 before the Common Era, almost 30 years after Caesar's fire. He describes the Mouseion in detail. He describes its walkways, its gardens, its dining hall, its scholars in residence. He says nothing about it being a ruin or having been recently rebuilt. He describes a working institution. The library was alive when he saw it. Second, the myth that Caesar destroyed the library is convenient. It is convenient because it gives us one villain, one moment, one event to point at and say, that is when the knowledge died. That is what the human brain wants. A clean story, a single match struck by a single famous man who can absorb all the blame. The truth is that the library died slowly, over centuries, and the people responsible were not famous and did not act in a single night. They were emperors who cut funding. They were officials who stopped paying scholars. They were generations who decided other things mattered more. The Caesar story lets us off the hook. If one man burned it, then no one else has to feel guilty. Third, the next major blow came 320 years later, 273 of the Common Era. The Roman Emperor Aurelian was reconquering the eastern provinces from the breakaway empire of Palmyra, ruled by Queen Zenobia. Alexandria had taken Zenobia's side. Aurelian besieged the city. The Brucheion district, the royal quarter, the district where the Mausion stood, was, according to the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, reduced to ruins during this campaign. This is when the main library complex appears to have actually been destroyed, not by Caesar, by Aurelian. 3 centuries after the fire, everyone blames. But Aurelian's destruction was not total either. There was a daughter library, a satellite branch in another part of the city. It was attached to a temple called the Serapeum, dedicated to the god Serapis. After Aurelian, the Serapeum became the surviving home of what remained of Alexandrian scholarship. The torch passed from the Mausion to the Serapeum, diminished but alive. The Serapeum would burn too, but not for another 120 years, and not by the hand of any Roman general. You have been blaming the wrong man for 2,000 years, friend. Caesar was a soldier in a tactical mess who set fire to ships. The fire spread. Some books burned. He sailed away. He never lifted a torch to a library wall in his life. The men who did, the men who actually walked into the temple of the Serapeum with axes and orders to destroy, those men wore robes, not armor. Roll the 3rd scroll closed. The 4th one is the one that hurts the most. The 4th scroll is a woman. Her name was Hypatia. She was born in Alexandria sometime around 370 of the Common Era, give or take a few years. Her father was Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer, and the last documented member of the Mausion. By Theon's lifetime, the Great Mausion was already gone. The Brucheion was rubble, but the tradition of Alexandrian scholarship survived in private homes, in the Serapeum, in small schools. Theon ran one of those schools. He taught his daughter everything he knew, and then he watched her surpass him. Hypatia became, by the consensus of every ancient source we have, the most respected philosopher and mathematician in the city. She lectured publicly. Students came from across the eastern Mediterranean to attend her courses on Plato, Aristotle, and the mathematics of Apollonius and Diophantus. She wrote commentaries on the great mathematical works, refining and clarifying them for new generations. She designed astronomical instruments, including, according to her student Synesius, an improved astrolabe and a hydrometer for measuring liquid density. She walked the streets of Alexandria in a philosopher's cloak and gave impromptu lectures in the agora. She refused to marry. She told one persistent suitor, in a story that may be apocryphal but certainly captures her reputation, that she was wedded to truth. She was, in every meaningful sense, the last living link to the Mausion. Her father had been the last documented member of the institution. She was his student. She was his successor. She carried in her head the chain of teaching that ran back, generation by generation, through Theon, through Pappus, through Diophantus, through Hipparchus, through Eratosthenes, through Euclid, through Demetrius of Phalerum, all the way back to Aristotle and to Ptolemy I Soter himself. 7 centuries of human thought. One woman. And in the city around her, something dark was rising. Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries was a city tearing itself apart along religious lines. The empire had become Christian. The pagan institutions, the temples, the philosophical schools, the libraries attached to temples were under increasing pressure. In 391 of the Common Era, the Emperor Theodosius I issued an edict banning pagan worship across the empire. In Alexandria, the bishop Theophilus took this as a license. He led a Christian mob to the Serapeum, the daughter library, the last surviving public collection of the Alexandrian tradition. They broke open the doors. They smashed the statue of Serapis. They burned the books. Hypatia was about 20 years old when this happened. The library her father studied in was destroyed in front of her. She was old enough to remember it. She was old enough to know what was lost. She kept teaching anyway. Theophilus died in 412. His nephew Cyril took the bishopric. Cyril was younger, more ambitious, more politically aggressive than his uncle. He saw Hypatia as a problem. She was famous, she was respected, she was friends with the Roman prefect of Egypt, a man named Orestes, who was a moderate Christian and who was resisting Cyril's attempts to expand church power into civil affairs. Cyril and Orestes were locked in a political struggle, and Hypatia was the most prominent person in Orestes' circle. In March of 415 of the Common Era, during the Christian season of Lent, a mob gathered. The ancient sources disagree on exactly who they were. Some say they were monks who had come into the city from the desert monasteries. Some say they were a faction of fanatical Christian street toughs known as the Parabolani who served the bishop. Some say both. They found Hypatia in her chariot, traveling through the city. They dragged her out. I am not going to describe to you in detail what happened next. The sources do, and the sources are graphic, and you can read them yourself if you have the stomach. I will tell you only this. They killed her. They killed her in a church, on holy ground, during Lent, with their bare hands and with sharpened pieces of pottery. They mutilated her body. They burned what was left in a place outside the city called Cinaron. She was somewhere between 40 and 60 years old. The sources do not agree on her age. The sources do not agree on much, but they agree on this. After her death, the great teachers of Alexandria left the city. The school was finished. The chain was broken. The last living link to the Mouseion was dead. The Library of Alexandria did not die in Caesar's fire. It did not die in Aurelian's siege. It did not die in the burning of the Serapeum. It died on a stone floor in a church in March of 415, when a mob beat a 60-year-old mathematician to death, and the city of Alexandria let them. Friend, listen to me carefully. I told you at the start of this video that the library was murdered by indifference. This is what I meant. There were people in Alexandria that day who could have stopped the mob. There were officials. There were soldiers. There were Christians who knew that what was happening was monstrous. They did nothing. They looked away. They let it happen. And the next day, when the city woke up and Hypatia was dead, life went on. Markets opened. Ships docked. Children went to school. Nobody rioted. Nobody marched. Nobody demanded justice. Cyril was never punished. He was, in fact, later made a saint. The library was not murdered in one night. It was murdered every time a parent told a child that philosophy was useless and a politician decided that knowledge was dangerous. It was murdered every time a citizen of Alexandria walked past the burning Serapeum and went home to dinner. It was murdered every time the people who could have defended it decided that defending it was somebody else's job. The fire that killed the Library of Alexandria is still burning. It is burning right now. It burns every time you scroll past a long article because it is too long. It burns every time a school cuts a humanities program because nobody fought for it. It burns every time we, you and I, decide that the difficult, slow, expensive work of keeping knowledge alive is not our problem. That is the lesson. That is the only lesson. Roll the fourth scroll closed. We have 2 more to go. The 5th and 6th scrolls are quicker because by now the body is already cold. We are only watching the funeral. Abel, after Aurelian's destruction of the Brucheion, by the late 4th century, it housed an estimated 40,000 scrolls. Not all that remained of the Alexandrian tradition, but the largest single collection still under one roof in the city. Theophilus organized the demolition with care. He did not wait for the temple to be closed by imperial inspectors. He marched. He brought a crowd of monks and laymen. The defenders of the Serapeum, a group of pagan philosophers and priests led by a teacher named Olympius, locked themselves inside with hostages. There was a standoff. The emperor ruled in favor of the Christians. The defenders were given safe passage out. Theophilus and his men entered the temple. They smashed the cult statue of Serapis with axes. They paraded the broken pieces through the streets. They burned the contents of the library annex. The bishop's biographer, a Christian named Rufinus, describes the event with pride. The scrolls, in his words, were the work of demons, and their burning purified the city. This is what your textbooks mean when they say the Christians destroyed the Library of Alexandria. They did, but they destroyed the daughter library, the one that had been built to replace what Aurelian had already destroyed a century before. The original Mouseion was already gone. What burned in 391 was the last surviving public collection of Alexandrian books. After that, scholarship in the city was private. Books were kept in homes, schools met in courtyards. The institution was finished. When Hypatia was killed 24 years later, there was no library left for her to teach in. She had been the library, and then she was not. Roll the 5th scroll closed. The 6th scroll is the one with the lie everyone repeats. The year is 642 of the Common Era. The Arab general Omar ibn al-As has captured Alexandria for the new caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab. The legend, repeated in textbooks and documentaries for 1400 years, goes like this. Omar asks the caliph what to do with the great Library of Alexandria. Umar replies, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are heretical. Either way, destroy them." Omar orders the books distributed to the public baths of the city to be used as fuel. There are so many books that they heat the baths of Alexandria for 6 full months. It is a great story. It is a story that has been used for centuries by Western writers to argue that Islamic civilization was hostile to learning, that the Arabs destroyed the classical heritage, that the great library of antiquity was extinguished by barbarian conquerors. The story is a lie. It does not appear in any source written within 500 years of the conquest. It is first recorded in the 13th century by a Syrian Christian writer named Bar Hebraeus, who was writing more than 600 years after the events he claimed to describe. The early Arab sources, who would have had every reason to record such a dramatic order from the caliph, say nothing about it. The contemporary Christian sources in Egypt, who would have had every reason to record such a dramatic outrage by the conquerors, say nothing about it. It is invented. It is a medieval polemic dressed up as history. There is also a simpler problem with the story. By 642, there was almost nothing left to burn. The Mouseion had been a ruin for 370 years. The Serapeum had been a ruin for 250 years. The private collections, the schools, the small libraries that had kept Alexandrian scholarship alive after Hypatia had been scattered, sold, decayed, or moved to Constantinople over the course of 2 centuries of imperial decline. When Amar's army entered Alexandria, they entered a city whose great age was a memory. There was no central library to destroy. There was no caliph's order. There was no 6 months of bathwater heated by burning books. What there was, and this is the part that breaks my heart, was silence. The Arab conquest was not a dramatic ending. It was a footnote. The library had already died. The conquerors arrived to find a corpse, and they did not even know it was a corpse. They moved in, they renamed streets, they built mosques. They went on with the business of empire. And somewhere in a private home in the city, the last person alive who had been taught by a teacher, whose teacher had been taught by a teacher, whose teacher had walked the gardens of the Mousillon, that person closed their eyes for the last time. And the chain ended. We do not know that person's name. There is no scroll for them. There is no monument. They were the final librarian of Alexandria, and history did not record them. Roll the sixth scroll closed. Place it back in the case. Lock the glass. What did we lose? I want to give you a list. It will not be complete. It cannot be complete. We do not know what we do not know. We lost the complete works of Democritus, the Greek philosopher who proposed in the 5th century before the Common Era that all matter was composed of indivisible particles he called atomos. He wrote, by ancient count, more than 70 books. We have fragments, we have quotations in other authors. We have not a single complete work. He described atoms 2,300 years before Niels Bohr drew his diagram of the atom. We do not know how close he came to the truth. We do not know what else he saw. The library knew. The library is gone. We lost 113 plays by Sophocles. He wrote 120. We have 7. Antigone, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, Electra, Ajax, the women of Trachis, Philoctetes. That is what we have. The other 113 are titles, just titles. Tereus, the captive women, Niobe, Polyxena, the loves of Achilles. We know what they were called. We do not know what they said. We lost the history of Carthage written by Carthaginians. The Romans destroyed the city in 146 before the Common Era and salted the earth and burned the Carthaginian libraries. The Library of Alexandria, in its prime, held copies, histories, trade records, religious texts, philosophical works. The Carthaginian language was Punic, related to Phoenician. We have almost no Punic literature today. We have inscriptions on tombstones. We have a single agricultural manual that survived because the Romans translated it after the war. Everything else, everything written by an entire civilization that controlled the Western Mediterranean for 600 years, is gone. The library held it. The library is gone. We lost the maps the Phoenicians drew. The Phoenicians sailed beyond Gibraltar. They reached Britain. There is evidence they reached the Azores. There are arguments, contested but not impossible, that they reached parts of West Africa. Possibly even further. They drew charts, they knew currents, they knew which winds carried a ship to which coast in which season. Their navigational knowledge was the most advanced on Earth for almost 1,000 years. They guarded it as a state secret while they lived. The Library of Alexandria, through trade and theft and copying, had pieces of it: maps, sailing manuals, star tables for ocean navigation. We have none of this. The Phoenician Maritime Archive was lost when Carthage fell, and the Alexandrian copies were lost when the library fell, and what humanity now knows about Phoenician seafaring fits in a single academic monograph. The library held the rest. The library is gone. We lost the medical works of Herophilus and Erasistratus, 2 physicians who worked at the Mousillon in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and who performed the first systematic human dissections in recorded history. They identified the nervous system. They distinguished between sensory and motor nerves. They mapped the chambers of the heart. They described the function of the brain as the seat of intelligence, at a time when most of the Mediterranean world believed thoughts came from the heart. Their books filled shelves. We have fragments, scraps, quotations in later writers. We do not have a single complete medical treatise from either of them. The library held them. The library is gone. We lost the engineering manuals of Ctesibius and Philo of Byzantium, who designed water clocks, automatic doors, hydraulic organs, and military catapults of frightening sophistication. We lost the astronomical models of Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed in the 3rd century before the Common Era that the Earth orbits the Sun, 1800 years before Copernicus. We have one short summary of his theory in Archimedes. The full work is gone. The library held it. The library is gone. I could keep listing. I will stop. I will stop because the list is not the point. The point is what is missing from the list. The point is the works we cannot list because we do not even know they existed. The travelogues of merchants who sailed past the edge of the known world. The poems of women whose names were never recorded. The histories of peoples the Greeks and Romans dismissed as barbarians. The technical manuals of crafts that died with their last practitioner. The philosophical schools that argued about questions we have not thought to ask. All of it. Gone. Vanished. Erased. We will spend the rest of human history trying to rediscover what one library in Egypt already knew. Some of what we have rediscovered came at terrible cost. We rediscovered atomic theory in the 20th century, 23 centuries after Democritus. We rediscovered that the Earth orbits the Sun in the 16th century, 18 centuries after Aristarchus. We rediscovered the size of the planet in the 18th century, 2,000 years after Eratosthenes. Each rediscovery cost lives. Galileo was put on trial. Bruno was burned. Generations of scholars were called heretics, lunatics, fools, before being proven right by people standing on their shoulders. Every one of those costs was already paid once, in Alexandria, by people whose names we have forgotten, by a librarian who measured the planet and was called second best, by a mathematician who was beaten to death in a church, by thousands of unnamed scribes who copied scrolls in lamplight for centuries while their institution slowly starved. We did not lose information. We lost teachers. We lost the chain. We lost the human beings who could have stood up in a lecture hall and said, "This is what we know. This is how we proved it." Here is the next question to ask. And once that chain breaks, no number of recovered fragments can rebuild it. You can excavate a scroll. You cannot excavate a tradition. That is what was inside the Library of Alexandria. Not just books, the accumulated, working, living understanding of what it meant to be a curious human being. The library was the place where, for 700 years, the human race kept its memory of itself. And when the library died, our memory died with it. I am putting the charred parchment back behind the glass now. The case clicks shut. The lock turns. The archive grows quieter. You can feel the air settle. Let me tell you what I want you to take from this video. The Library of Alexandria was not murdered. I have said this 3 times in this video, and I am going to say it one more time, because it is the only sentence in this video that matters. The library was not murdered. It died of indifference. Every villain in this story, Caesar, Aurelian, Theophilus, Cyril, the mob in March of 415, the caliph who never gave the order, every single one of them did less damage than the centuries of slow neglect that came before, between, and after them. The library was already wounded when Caesar's fire reached the docks. The library was already dying when Aurelian siege engines battered the Brucheion. The library was already a ghost when Theophilus broke down the doors of the Serapeum. The library was already a corpse when the Arabs arrived. Each act of violence struck something that was already half gone, because the people who should have defended it had stopped caring. Generation by generation, decade by decade, budget cut by budget cut, until there was no one left to fight for it. You think this is ancient history. It is not. It is happening right now. It is happening in every public library that loses its funding. It is happening in every university that closes its classics department because no one signs up for the courses. It is happening every time a parent tells a child that history and philosophy and dead languages are useless. That the only thing worth studying is whatever pays. It is happening every time a politician calls knowledge dangerous, and the rest of us shrug and change the channel. The fire that killed the Library of Alexandria is the same fire. It never went out. It just moved cities. Friend, listen. The reason I tell you these stories, the reason I keep this archive, the reason I show you charred parchment behind glass is not because I want you to mourn what was lost. Mourning is easy. Mourning is what you do when there is nothing left to save. I want you to ask yourself a different question. I want you to ask yourself what you are doing today, this week, this year, to make sure that when our children look back at our century, they do not have to make a list like the one I just made for you. A list of what we knew and forgot and let burn and never wrote down and lost. The Library of Alexandria did not need a hero to save it. It needed 10,000 ordinary people every single year for 700 years to care just a little bit more, to fund the scribes, to copy the scrolls, to send their children to the schools, to defend the institution when it was attacked. None of those people would have been famous. None of them would be in your history book. But if they had existed, you and I would today be standing in a library in Alexandria, and we would be reading Sophocles in full, and we would know what happened to Carthage. Those people did not exist. Or they existed, and there were not enough of them. That is the lesson. That is the only lesson. Indifference is the assassin. Indifference is the fire. Indifference is the mob in the church, and the soldier in the harbor, and the bishop with the axe, and the caliph who never gave the order. All of them, all of these names in your textbooks, were just symptoms. The disease was and is the slow and silent agreement of millions of ordinary people that knowledge is somebody else's problem. Do not be that. Please. Do not be that. I am Mortimer Quill. The archive is closing for tonight. There is one more thing in the case before I lock the door. A small glass ampule. Inside it, a pinch of gray ash. I do not know whose. The label, in my own handwriting, says only, "From the dock warehouse, Alexandria, 48 before the Common Era, possibly Sophocles, possibly a shipping manifest, possibly nothing at all." I keep it because I do not want to forget. I keep it because someone has to. Next time, friend, I am going to open a different case. I am going to show you a piece of paper recovered from a private collection in 1937, which is, as far as we can tell, the last surviving page of a book that the Soviet state spent 40 years pretending had never existed. The man who wrote it was erased from photographs, from newspapers, from his own family's memory. His name was removed from the registry of his own university. He was, officially, never born, but the page survived. And on it, in his handwriting, is the answer to a question that two governments on two continents have spent 80 years trying to bury. I will see you at the archive. The candle goes out. End.